Again, Terry is giving a presentation on solving Alaska's fiscal crisis. Terry, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be with everybody. And before I dive into my presentation, I was just give a shout out. I guess it's totally Alaska style. I remember it was always tough to go in my legislative days to go grocery shopping because you would just run into people you knew and people wanted to, you know, uh, tell you about something really important to them and they hadn't seen you for a while. And this is sort of like that. I see folks on here that were involved with me with our seafood processing company, Silver Lining and Norquest. I see people I served with in the legislature and people who worked for me in the legislature and just all kinds of connections. I want to give a shout out to some of my friends at Anvil Corporation, which is an oil and gas company that does engineering all over the oil and gas industry in Alaska and the Northwest. It's an employee-owned company, great company. So it's just wonderful to have all these different connections and, like I say, just like going through the post office or the grocery store, you're just going to bump into a lot of people you've known from different walks and experiences in life. That's Alaska. Well, Alaska does have a fiscal crisis, and in round numbers, it's at least $1 billion a year as far as anyone can run out a spreadsheet. And it's been very well documented. There's no real disagreement about that. The Alaska Department of Revenue has published lots of information. In fact, Governor Dunleavy's most recent budget shows in their 10-year projection that there is a plan for new revenues of $1 billion a year. But of course, it's starting next year, and we don't know what those revenues would be. The Legislative Finance Division, as I've listened, and I'm sure all of you have seen presentations where they lay out the size of the chronic annual deficit. And we also have independent economists who've looked at all the data. So there's really not, any doubt there it is. But that doesn't mean it's something that, every Alaskan voter walks up and down the street thinking about every day. And unfortunately, this structural deficit has been complicated, I think, in terms of resolving it and exacerbated by several factors because it hasn't been dealt with in the last decade since it's been known that it's a ticking time bomb. And this delay, one of the impacts of the delay is the reduction of options to solve the problem. The governor's budget right now is in plan for some hefty new pandemic size permanent fund dividends would actually, for example, reduce the ongoing revenues of the state by $160 million a year. So in essence, it would just make the chronic deficit bigger and therefore harder to solve. In addition, of course, the recession driven by the pandemic has really hit the basic industries, the oil and gas industry, tourism, fisheries, really hard in Alaska. And we're not sure when we can project they'll be back to normal. And I personally have a lot of great sympathy for all the small businesses that don't have the wherewithal to, withstand the kind of impact and have closed down or, are on their last leg as this thing drags on. And I think there's a new complicating factor, which I'll talk about a little bit today too, is that I think is potentially dangerous, is the population in Alaska has begun to shrink and has shrunk over the last 4 years. Since the fiscal crisis has been known about for the last decade, there's been many proposals And they really fall into three basic buckets. Reduce government services, reduce or eliminate the permanent fund dividend, or increase taxes. Primary among those options are oil, personal income tax, statewide sales tax, and other smaller revenue generators. And then, of course, there's various proposals that would combine elements of all three of those. And I think the question that I want to deal with is, why has this problem persisted for at least a decade? And to me, I think the problem is a political problem in that there is not a political consensus of Alaska voters. There's you can hear lots of things and lots of ideas, but I've seen a lot of polls over the years, and there's no consensus. And that lack of consensus of voters then ripples through in which people are elected to the legislature, and it impacts the behavior of elected officials because they can feel there's no consensus. They don't see that when they talk to their constituents. Examples of the lack of consensus with the voters is the recent proposal on an initiative to raise oil taxes, which failed. And another example is the Governor Dunleavy's recent attempts to shrink government services. There was a lot of pushback from legislators. There was a recall, still is out there, and the governor walked back a lot of his more drastic measures. Another example is Republican legislators who lost their election in 2020, apparently because they collaborated with Democrats and independents primarily around fiscal issues. So there's a very strong message, and now we have a legislature that's split into many different camps with many different ideas, none of which, very few of them align with the governor. So there's no consensus in the political realm, but I think it really starts with voters. And so I think what the question is, how can you build a consensus among Alaskan voters about resolving the fiscal crisis, which then I think you would see the elected leaders, the governor and the legislature, moving forward. It's like I say, it's not like they don't know what the options are and they need a study or anything. They know what the options are. It's a matter of politics, of political will, and the support, or at least the acceptance of voters. So if we look at history about how change and significant policies have come about in Alaska, how other crises and challenges were resolved, we can see there's three different leadership models. The first is leadership by the governor, which is in Alaska definitely the easiest path to go. The second option for leadership is leadership coming out of the legislature, which is harder, and I'll get into why that's harder. And lastly, we have examples in history of a movement, a grassroots movement where an idea or a direction for the state was started at the voter level and then grew and expanded, and elected officials carried the torch. But it started with the public and built by the voters. So Alaska, based on the way our Constitution is designed, created a very strong governor, probably the strongest governor model of the 50 states. And so the whole concept there then creates that as the best and most workable option. There are no other statewide competing elected officials with different voices as there are in other states. everybody in the executive branch basically reports to the governor. The governor has very strong budget control and very flexible. That's one of the things our Constitution recognized. They looked at other states and decided that they needed a cleaner, simple way. So if the voters wanted to change the governor and change the direction of the state, they could through the budget, one of the biggest tool. And I think as people saw in the recent years, it's very difficult, if not near impossible, for the legislature to override the governor's budget vetoes with that 3/4 vote. And of course, the governor has the biggest bully pulpit in the state to communicate to the public, to get the message out. And because the entire executive branch is unified under the governor, he has the biggest communication machine. But the legislature is another option if the governor is not leading to build and successful in building the public consensus and getting the legislature behind. So it can work, and we have examples of it, but it's more complicated because ultimately the legislatures got two houses, a minority party, a majority party, or coalitions, and ultimately they have to convince the governor of what their plan is and the wisdom of their plan. It's also much harder for the legislature to build public support and backing for some idea or plan, because there's multiple voices in the legislature, and the media likes to present, well, the majority presented this plan, the minority criticized it, had a different option, then there's the House and the Senate again. So the public isn't sure, well, because there's multiple voices telling them multiple things. So it's a little harder in the same for the legislature trying to communicate some plan or direction through the media. And the most difficult, I think, but it has worked, and we'll go into some of those examples, is a public movement. And one of the challenges of a movement, ultimately, it does have to become statewide. Maybe not every single district and community, but it cannot just be Southeast pushing something or Anchorage only pushing something. So organizing a movement, especially with organizing a lot of volunteers across the state, that's a big challenge. And for it to have any legs and continuity, you need some kind of funding. And generally, movements have gotten some kind of funding from philanthropies or businesses, because it's sort of hard to just raise it from the grassroots. Even if you can get a lot of volunteers there, it's hard to raise the significant amount of money to have a core of management, administration, communication for a movement. So we can look at a few examples of what I'm talking about here in terms of examples of the governor leading change. Governor Egan was our first governor. He led, I'd say, in creating the ferry system, which then expanded other people, legislators, and governors picked it up, expanded it and stuff. But that was led by the governor. Governor Egan also led a negotiation in 1973 when the Alaska pipeline construction was stalled out. He negotiated a deal with all the oil companies, which was very complicated, called a special session, introduced, I believe it was 8 bills. And yeah, the legislature had its input, but basically the deal was confirmed. Very complex, the largest construction project in North America was put together across all these public lands, and it went forward. But the governor led that process, had to convince the legislature and get the public behind that. Governor Hammond had an idea. He had an idea about dividends from the permit fund. It wasn't originally part of the permit fund, but it was an idea that just started with the governor and then it built forward. So these are all examples of where the governor leads some big policy or change or resolves some crisis, as in the case of the pipeline being stalled out. An example of legislative leadership would be the creation of the permanent fund itself, the constitutional amendment, and then later the management structure. These were an idea that came out of the legislature, and the legislature had to convince both the public and the governor to make it become real. And so, but it came out of the legislature, and the legislature had to do all those leadership things that I've been talking about. A couple examples of movements in Alaska would be the statehood movement and the Alaska Native Lands Claim Settlement. That took a long time, but ultimately, the Native leaders and Native people convinced state and federal officials, and the land claim settlement was finally created. On the national level, we have the civil rights movement. I think an interesting one is when you look at gay rights and marriage. This was a movement by a group that wanted to change things. And one of the things they did ultimately that was very successful is they went to Hollywood and they convinced people in Hollywood to have more gay and lesbian roles in TV and sitcom and movies, and to normalize those roles. And American people became more comfortable through learning through the media and getting comfortable. And as public opinion changed, ultimately, we had a Supreme Court case, but they were only confirming what a movement had done and the change in public opinion. It was not the Supreme Court or Congress leading and convincing the American public of that change. And so on. The one I was greatly involved in was national health reform, which again was more of a, really had a true and a long time grassroots movement, convincing one state, the governor and the legislature in Massachusetts, to do comprehensive health reform, which then led and was the spark to national health reform and the Affordable Care Act. But that is the way that, bubbled up from the bottom. So I think that our fiscal crisis is going to take a governor, the legislature, or a movement going out there and doing more than simply proposing an oil tax or proposing an income tax, or proposing one constitutional amendment. I think Alaska voters are going to have a bigger picture, a vision of the choices before them. If you were to do a projection and say 10 years from now, if we just continue with the current set of public policies for revenue and expenditures and the permanent fund and taxes, here's where we'll end up. And if we pass this reform package, this is where we end up. Which Alaska do you want to live in? I think people need some kind of broader picture of where the state's going out there, because otherwise people don't understand why they need to change. Why do they need to give up their dividend? Why do they have to pay more taxes? Why should they give up their services? They aren't living and breathing public policy and politics every day. They're leading their lives, working, taking care of their families. And so I think there has to be a broader picture painted, and that would be the leadership that ideally, as I said, the easiest way is for the governor. I think what a governor would do is go out there and have conversations and provide a two-way conversation, listening to people's concerns, especially now in the pandemic. How are our basic industries of tourism, fisheries, oil, gas, how are they going to rebuild And how are these small businesses going to be revived? Native corporations are important business employers and provide uh, lots of jobs and dividends that are important in the Alaska economy. All these entities and groups need to be sat down with and have conversation about the fiscal crisis, but also about, what's the future of the state? What are the challenges they're facing, especially at this point in time, and how does that fit in? And then, of course, there's other stakeholder groups in Alaska, whether you're talking about the education community, municipalities, the city, boroughs, labor unions, and other groups representing employees, community groups concerned about basic services, whether it's ferries, roads, or police. These same kinds of two-way conversations where you listen and provide information about this fiscal crisis. This is the only way you're going to build a consensus, is to have a conversation out there. And then I think you can go forward and provide some kind of vision of where Alaska is going and where you want it to go, and people can get on board with that. But otherwise, all they can see is, somebody's proposing a new tax, or somebody's proposing cutting a service to their schools or the ferry, or taking away their dividend. And that's just painful for them. And so, of course, they're going to reject it unless they're given some, more of aspirational reason for why we need to do this and why it's going to be good in the long run. Now, as I say, it's easiest because of who the governor is and all the tools and powers the governor has to do this. But if the governor is not going to do that, and then, okay, you need legislative leadership to step forward to try to do the same things I'm describing. And if they can't do that, and then we need a movement, of group of Alaskans building an organization across the state, trying to do the very same steps. I don't think it matters ultimately who is leading as much as taking all these steps to build the consensus, because ultimately, I think that's what we're missing. We don't have a consensus. So everybody that just tries to propose one idea to resolve this is going to get shot down or voted out of office or something. And as we've seen, I think that I did want to mention one other thing before I wrapped up here, that I'm very concerned about. It is the population decline that has started. It's in the papers recently that population decline was 4,000. That doesn't sound like a big number. And it was 14,000 over the last 4 years. But one of the things to keep in mind is Alaska has the highest in and out migration rate of any state, more than double any. Every year, historically, we've had about 40,000 people move out of the state and a different 40,000 move in. And sometimes we have more move in than move out. So we have a population gain. In the recent years, we've had less people moving in and more moving out, but still, it's like a lot of people moving in and out. So it's very easy for us to have the 40,000 people leave Alaska, but only have 30,000 or 25,000 move in, and we would rapidly have population decline. I think another factor that we don't know how this is going to pan out is, will the US economy bounce back after the pandemic is resolved faster than the Alaska economy? And this would certainly pull heavily on Alaskans who don't have employment, or their businesses failed, or the business is not doing well, to move to greener pastures just from the economic necessity. So we really need to, I think, study that area. There hasn't been any good studies to understand what would be the impact of population decline in Alaska. And as it's hard for me to believe there might be some positive, less people, you wouldn't have to pay as much in dividends or state services, but I think overall it would pretty much, there's a lot, the list of the negative impacts of population decline are much larger. So anyway, just think we need to put some effort into studying that so we understand it. So again, in conclusion, I think we are not going to get to a sustainable long-term fiscal plan, which requires some very big changes under no matter which proposal you're in favor of and or think is most workable, unless we get a consensus of voters through some type of leadership, whether it's the governor, the legislature, or voters mobilizing into some movement to be the spark. So with that, be happy to have more of a conversation.
I will stop the recording then, and